What's up, YouTubers and plant lovers? It's Justin, and today I was going to show you how I care for and plant my Rhaphidophora Tetrasperma. Now, this plant has many misleading common names. The mini monstera, the mini splitleaf, the Jenny philodendron, and then I've also heard it called the philodendron piccolo. Now, this plant is neither a philodendron or a monstera, even though they are in the same family. There is a little bit of a resemblance between this plant and the monsteras, from the fenestrations up to the aerial roots and to the unusually fast kind of growth they both display. Now, philodendrons and monsteras are native to around Central and South America. This guy is native to southern Thailand and Malaysia. So this guy is a tropical plant. He needs to have the same conditions met in your home in order to get him to thrive and look really well. Now, I will tell you, these guys are very hardy. It usually takes a lot to kill these guys, but other than that, they're very easy to care for. As I said earlier, they need to have certain conditions met in the home in order to get them to thrive. Those conditions would be kind of really bright, filtered, dappled sunlight, a decent amount of water, the correct soil, and higher amounts of humidity. If you can zone in on these certain aspects of its conditions, then I think your plant will be right as rain and start to thrive. As I said, when it comes to sunlight, these guys really do prefer bright, kind of filtered sunlight. They can't take too much direct sunlight. They can take some, especially established plants. But new growth will kind of scorch relatively easily, and if it's left unchecked, it could probably kill your plant. Now, established plants can take a little bit of direct sunlight, though not too much. I found with this guy, he really likes being under the bright LEDs that I have. They kind of keep him happy and healthy. I usually leave the light on for anywhere from about 10 to 12 hours a day, and he loves it. The LEDs kind of match the intensity and the amount of light for the right duration, and he's put on a lot of mass since I first got him, probably about 3 or 4 months ago. Now, I said, these guys are pretty quick growers, and that's really what makes them a great plant to have. They're fast growing like their monstera cousins, but be warned, they are toxic plants. They are toxic to little ones, little children, and to pets. So don't let your birds or your dogs or your cats nibble on them. A little bit probably won't hurt them if they just do 1 or 2 little bites, but if they do ingest a decent amount, you could have stomach cramps, nausea, vomiting, and if left unchecked and they eat a bunch, it could probably kill them. So be very careful with this plant. Now, when it comes to water, these guys are avid drinkers. They're not very high drinkers, though they do require a little bit more than like your bonsais, but they're kind of right up there with the orchids. Typically, when the top inch or 2 inches of the soil dries out, I'll go ahead and give my plant some more water. Usually, when it comes to watering, they are more forgiving with underwatering than they are with overwatering. Again, you have to watch that fine line right there, because too much water will increase the chances of your plant dying from fungal root rot. Now, of course, as we all know, a lot of factors go into deciding how much water your plant needs. If it's too hot outside, the water levels need to increase. If it's really windy or you have a draft or the ceiling fan's going, you're going to need to increase the amount of water your plant needs. The type of media will affect that, and the amount of humidity in a home will affect that as well. And talking about humidity, I would say since these guys are tropical plants, they do need to have a humidity of around 40% or higher. Typically, homes are anywhere from about 20 to 30, and that's being a little generous. But if yours is around 30 to 40, I think your plant will be just fine. Obviously, a little bit higher levels of humidity will do your plant better, though some people say that they can remain fairly well in dry climates. I have mine sitting rather close to a humidifier, and he seems to be right at home with that. In talking about soil, this guy's a little bit tricky. They are epiphytes, so they will kind of grow up because they are vining plants on trees. So when it comes to soil, I always do about 4 parts of a reputable potting soil, typically one that's designed for succulent and cacti because it has a decent amount of sand in it and it won't hold on to a bunch of water. I'll also put about 1 part perlite in with 1 part orchid bark mix, and then a little bit of coco coir to kind of match that acidity that these guys like. Now, I'm not saying they enjoy really acidic soils, but they do like lightly acidic soils to about neutral. So anywhere from about 6.1 on up to 7.5 for these guys would be ideal. Now, one of the trickier things in dealing with this plant would be the fertilizer. These guys are quick growers, so they do need to be fed regularly. But in feeding these guys, they have really sensitive roots and will suffer from fertilizer burn relatively quickly. So you need a optimal, organic, slow-release fertilizer that doesn't have any urea or any other harsh chemicals in it that would burn this guy out. When it comes to pest, this guy really doesn't suffer too much from any kind of problems or pest. I do know that they do have a particular problem with spider mites though, so you got to be very careful and pay attention to that. Spider mites can be very difficult to see by the naked eye, so you'll have to identify spider mites another way and look your plant over and see if you see any kind of filaments that look like they might be considered spider webs. And if you do, that may be a good indication that you do actually have spider mites on your plant. Typically with spider mites, they are very easy to get rid of depending on how bad or how severe the case is. You can take your plant outside and spray it off with the garden hose, or setting in the bathtub and spraying off with detachable shower head, and the strong blast of water will knock a majority of those pests off. Now, if your infestation is rather large, you may have to prune your plant back rigorously after spraying the plant off. And if it's bad enough, you may have to introduce some neem oil to help combat the spider mites. Other than spider mites, the only other kind of growth problem I know with these guys from talking with other gardeners is that their growth rate is a little leggy sometimes. I wanted to buy a trellis or a moss pole for this guy, but I don't know if you've considered or tried to buy anything for a plant in the dead of winter in a small town. It's almost like they think, oh, summer's over, all plants are dead, right? So you can't find nothing in a small town for plants in the dead of winter. So I had to go online to see if I can find a moss pole. Hopefully mine will be in tomorrow. I'm going to go ahead and repot him, and then after I receive the pole, I will go ahead and kind of train him up on it and stick the pole down in the soil, and he should be okay then. Now, I've seen a lot of growers actually try this plant as a hanging plant, but I've noticed that with those, the leaves tend to be really kind of spaced out and kind of leggy and look almost ideolated. So they do better, I think, if you train them up on a trellis or a moss pole instead of letting them hang down and dangle. Now, the ideolation really can take effect on this plant if you're not paying attention. Higher amounts of light will really help this plant in that case. And if you don't think that your plant is getting enough sunlight, introduce some artificial grow light with your plant also. Now, as I said earlier, you really want to introduce the right amount of light for this plant. Basically, that is the maximum amount of light that you can give this plant without actually scorching or burning the leaves. As I was saying earlier, I find it's better to use some artificial grow light to help them out. Especially in the dead of winter in northern Kentucky, I don't get a whole bunch of bright light around this time. So naturally, I put him underneath the LEDs and he seems to have really taken off. Because if you don't have enough light, the leaves will be further spaced out, the grow rate will slow tremendously, and your plant won't look as happy and healthy as it normally could if it was receiving the right amount of light. Alright, now that all being said, I'm going to go ahead and get him ready in his newer home to have him in this larger pot. Now, I do know with these plants, they are particular to having a lot of room for developing new root and new root mass. So whenever you go ahead and pot up your new plant, you need to pick a pot that is a little bit deeper than you would probably go. You don't want it to be too shallow. They have to have plenty of room so their roots can kind of spread out and thus give them more room on top to kind of spread out and get more bushy. As always, I recommend you sterilizing your new container with hot soap and water and a scrub brush, and then rinsing it out really well and giving your plant the best start possible in his new home. Now, of course, with my concoctions, I usually eyeball them, but I'm using the cacti and succulent and citrus soil, and then mixing in a couple of handfuls of orchid bark potting mix to give it a little bit room for air to get down in there. And to help with drainage, mix just a little bit of coco coir in. Mix it all up by hand. You don't want it all to sit in the same spot. You want it to be fairly even. And I have my ceiling fan on to mix in some perlite. Do not ever breathe in this dust. Hold your breath. As we know, perlite helps with root development and drainage. Now, if you can kind of tell, you can see the orchid bark and the perlite, and a little bit of the coco coir down in there. And the soil comes up to about right here. It's almost about 3/4 of the way full. I will have a little divot in the bottom so that the plant's roots will have a place to sit. And because the roots are really sensitive, I'm just going to take my time, lightly squeeze the root mass so that we don't break anything or disturb anything too bad. And then I'll hold it with one hand, turn it over with the other. And I've got this container under me to catch any falling debris. Shake off a little bit of this other soil, not too much. And then I will take him and then set him down in the middle. Push him up a little bit towards the front so that when the moss pole arrives, I will have a little bit of room to kind of stick it down in there without actually damaging any of the roots. And then I'll mix the rest in with about the same consistency that I did previously. Now it is a little bit harder to mix in the soil at the top than it is on the bottom, but that's fine. Just take your finger or fingers and lightly just work them down into the area that you're wanting to mix up. Lightly just kind of pull them back and mix it all in as you go around. And as always, lightly tamp down the soil so that your plant will be lightly locked in the middle, and you can get rid of any other air bubbles that may remain around the roots. And then just keep adding in what you need to get you where you want it to be. All right. Now I think he's about where I want him to be. I've got plenty of room in the back for his moss pole to train him up properly. Until then, he's got enough support to hold him in for a couple of days, assuming it doesn't come in on time. Now, before I recorded, I knew I was going to have to transplant him, so I washed him off really well last night and gave him a good watering. I still need to add a little bit of water to remove any other air bubbles that may remain, though I will set him underneath the fan tonight to make sure that he's not going to have too much water in there without being able to get rid of some of it. As we know, you always want to have a drainage hole in the bottom of your pot or drainage holes in there to help get rid of any other excess water that your plant no longer needs. And that's why I chose to put him in a terracotta pot as well, because terracotta is porous and will help get rid of any other excess water that the plant no longer needs. I also had a comment the other day from a viewer who asked me about potting up too largely. Now, as I said, with this guy, they like to develop a lot of root mass below the soil, so they do need a deeper, larger pot for them to kind of fill up on. So I went from the 6-inch pot that he was in to this pot, which is about, from the outside, it measured 10 inches, so I would say about a 9.5-inch pot, though I guess it could still be considered a 10-inch pot. But if you know what you're doing, you can jump up a little bit higher than normal. Typically, you don't want to do that because you will invite root rot from all the overwatering or too much moisture that your plant will receive. If you water accordingly, your plant will be fine. But I cannot guarantee that. As long as you monitor the amount of water your plant receives, the amount of light it receives, and fertilizer, you should be okay in jumping up with your container size. Though if you feel that you aren't able to actually monitor that to your plant's benefit, then I would not suggest jumping up too large in container sizes. Now in nature, these plants usually get about 12 feet tall, but indoors they're usually kept more around 5 to 6 feet tall. I think it's about 4 to 5 feet tall. Now the only thing left I have to do besides adding in the moss pole would be to go ahead and water this plant to make sure that I can get rid of any other air bubbles that tamping may have missed. When I receive the moss pole, I will go ahead and add it in there and record that to show you how I train this plant up on the pole and what it'll look like afterwards.
Eventually.
Alright, I finally got my support stakes in, and then about 2 years later I was finally ready to record, so I will go ahead and insert the bottom support stake here. These are rather nice too. I got these off Amazon. They actually have a little hole in the top so that you can add the other one in to increase the length of your support pole. So very gently I will go ahead and lift the plant up and then insert the wooden part down into the soil gently. You don't want to just shove it down in there and then accidentally break or poke some of the roots in there and potentially do any damage. Now I can tell the plant is well past the support stake, so I will go ahead and insert the other one just to make it a little bit taller and to give him a little bit more room to climb up and then support himself on. As I said, I got these off Amazon, so they're really nice. They're not very big, but for what I'm doing, I think it would be adequate. It came with twist ties to help support him onto the pole, or these gardening twine. Now, I rather fancy the twist ties because they're easier to get on and off, and you don't actually have to tie them really tight to actually get them on there. Plus they're a little bit plastic, so that if they do get wet like the twine does, I don't really have to worry about any kind of mold or anything like that. So very lightly I will attach the plant just to kind of hold him in the right place, and then I'll twist the tie around just a couple times in the back. Now you want to leave a little bit of space so that as it grows, it won't rub raw any kind of opening on the plant here on the stem. I think for now, one will suffice. I may go back later and add another one up top. But just because this is kind of the leading stem, I don't really want to pin him down. So I think this one support will be okay. Though I may be able to put one here. Now take care not to support it right above a leaf stem or a petiole or a node, because you don't want it to get caught under one of these ties and then not be able to grow up through it. So that he's got plenty of room to grow in. Now I've got this bottom one right underneath a leaf stalk or stem, so he'll have a little bit of room to kind of grow up through it before he gets to his other petiole, and then when it hits that, he won't be able to advance anymore. So it'll either break it off or start rubbing it raw, and you don't want that. So make sure you keep it loose so the plant can continue to grow. And now that he's supported up, he'll start developing some aerial roots and actually take off and put on some more mass. Now as you can tell on this side of the plant, he's kind of getting a little bit more bushy with more leaf growth over here. So I've got to be sure that I rotate him evenly to make sure that even light distribution actually occurs over here as well, to actually help with more leaf growth on this side. If you don't, you'll have growth on one side and your plant really won't look natural or healthy or symmetrical. So always make sure that you're rotating your plants. Even if they're under grow lights, you do need to make sure that all sides are evenly getting the right amount of light for about the same duration. And then when you water the plant, you'll want to actually kind of water the moss pole too. You don't actually have to soak it and saturate it, but it's nice to actually give it some water so that the aerial roots will be able to get a little moisture as well. Now the only other thing I could do now would be to prune him just a little bit. You can pinch off the top of the plant to actually help it kind of branch out more, but I think mine's doing fine just now. So I may wait a little bit. I'll probably do an update video on this guy to show how all this is going, and then what I'll do next for the next growing support. because it won't take long for him to actually pass this up. As I always say, you want to keep your leaves clean as well. So I will wipe these down to actually make sure that the plant is able to take in the right amount of light and photosynthesize properly, and also breathe correctly as well. If they're covered in dust and hard water stains, that does make their job a little bit more difficult. As always, I use the same concoction. You can use a nice microfiber type washcloth with some warm water to wipe them off, but if you really want to get them to shine and really get them a little bit more clean than water would, I always use 4 parts water to 1 part lemon juice and wipe the leaves off top and bottom. Well guys, that's really all I wanted to say about this plant. If you have any kind of questions or comments or concerns, leave them below in the comment section and let me know if you've ever had any kind of success or failures with this plant. And while you're at it, hit the subscribe button or the bell next to it. That way you'll know anytime that I've uploaded a new video. If you know anybody that has this plant or is interested in one of these plants, feel free to share my videos. That always helps me out tremendously. And until next time, don't forget, always plant prudently. Thank you, YouTube.